smell of lavender in the foyer of number 84 Willow Creek was thick enough to coat the back of a man's throat like wax. It was a clean, grandmotherly scent that usually signaled safety and starch, but for Mark, it had become the scent of a tomb. He sat on the edge of a floral-patterned armchair, watching Mrs. Gable pour Earl Grey from a porcelain pot. Her hands, spotted with the pale marks of age, were steady as a surgeon's. Across from them sat Officer Miller, his utility belt creaking as he leaned forward to accept a lemon biscuit. Miller was laughing, a deep, belly-shaking sound that felt like a sacrilege in a house where, just 3 days ago, an elderly man named Arthur had been coughing his lungs into a handkerchief. Arthur was gone now. Mrs. Gable said he had been picked up by a nephew from Chicago in the middle of the night. Mark knew Arthur did not have a nephew. Mark knew because he had spent the last 4 nights sitting in the dark of his apartment across the street, his camera lens pressed against the glass, watching the shadow of a woman dragging heavy, garden-sized leaf bags toward the rose bushes at 3 in the morning. Mrs. Gable smiled at Mark, her eyes crinkling into maps of benevolence. She looked like the portrait of every beloved aunt in history, wearing a knitted cardigan the color of oatmeal and a strand of imitation pearls. She told the officer how much she worried about the young people today, how Mark looked a bit peaked, and how he needed more of her shepherd's pie. Miller patted her hand, calling her the saint of Willow Creek, a woman who took in the discarded souls of the city, the veterans with shaking hands, and the widows with empty bank accounts, and gave them a final port in the storm. Mark felt the weight of a silver locket in his pocket, a piece of jewelry he'd found caught in the iron grate of the porch earlier that morning. It contained a photo of a young woman and the initials of a tenant who had supposedly moved to Florida 6 months ago. The police did not want to hear it. They were too busy eating her biscuits and basking in the warmth of a woman who charged her tenants their entire Social Security checks for the privilege of disappearing. The realization that the law was not a shield, but a blindfold hit Mark like a physical blow. He had moved to the neighborhood for the quiet, but the silence at Mrs. Gable's was different. It was a vacuum. He started a ledger, a meticulous record written in longhand to avoid the digital eyes of a town that seemed obsessed with its own image. He noted the arrivals, the limping man in the beige coat, the woman with the tattered suitcase, the veteran who screamed in his sleep until one Tuesday when the screaming simply stopped. He noted the dates, the 14th of October, the 22nd of November, the 3rd of January. Each date marked an arrival, but there were no departures. The only things that left the house were the bags of trash and the occasional stench of bleach that wafted through the neighborhood on humid afternoons. Psychological walls began to close in as Mark decided to play the role of the concerned neighbor, offering to help Mrs. Gable with her gardening. The backyard was a masterpiece of horticultural excess. The hydrangeas were the size of human heads, and the roses were a deep, bruised crimson that looked almost wet in the sunlight. Mrs. Gable stood over him as he worked, her shadow long and thin across the soil. She spoke of the importance of nitrogen, of how things must die so that others can bloom. Her voice was like velvet over gravel. As Mark dug a hole for a new trellis, his spade hit something that did not sound like a rock. It was a dull, hollow thud. His heart hammered against his ribs. He glanced up to see Mrs. Gable watching him, her smile not reaching her eyes, which remained as cold and fixed as marbles. She handed him a glass of lemonade, her fingers lingering on his, and told him that he was such a helpful boy, so much like the others who had stayed there. She mentioned that a room was becoming available soon, the one with the sunlight, and that a young man like him should not be living in a cramped apartment when he could have a home. The horror of the boarding house was not found in blood-spattered walls or chained doors. It was found in the sheer, polite normalcy of it all. Mrs. Gable kept the floors waxed to a mirror shine and the lace curtains bleached white. She spent her afternoons at the kitchen table, her reading glasses perched on her nose, meticulously filling out forms. To the world, she was a caretaker. To the bank, she was a conduit for the pensions of the forgotten. Mark realized that she was not just killing people. She was harvesting their identities. She was a ghost maker, turning living men into paper trails that ended in her pocket. He watched from his window as the mail carrier delivered checks for people who had not breathed air in months. The sun set over the garden, casting the shadows of the tall sunflowers over the mounds of earth, and Mark knew that he was no longer just an observer. He was a witness. And in a town where the police were fed by the killer, being a witness was a death sentence written in beautiful, cursive script. By the middle of February, the atmosphere in the neighborhood had grown thick with a cloying, artificial sweetness. Mark's obsession had reached a fever pitch. He had spent 3 nights without sleep, his eyes bloodshot, watching the backyard of number 84. On the 17th of February, a new tenant arrived, a frail, white-haired man named Mr. Henderson. He carried a single violin case and moved with the cautious grace of a man who had spent his life in concert halls. Within 48 hours, the music that drifted from the upstairs window abruptly ceased. Mark knew he could not wait for the slow gears of a crooked bureaucracy to turn. Under the cover of a freezing rainstorm on the 21st of February, he used a spare key he had lifted from Mrs. Gable's apron during a volunteer shift to slip into the basement. The air downstairs was a sharp contrast to the lavender-scented rooms above. It smelled of damp earth, lye, and a heavy, metallic tang that made the hair on his arms stand up. The basement was divided into neat, organized sections. On one shelf sat dozens of canisters of quicklime. On another, a row of mason jars filled with what looked like gold teeth and wedding bands, each labeled with a date written in elegant calligraphy. As he moved deeper into the shadows, his flashlight beam landed on a desk. There, stacked in perfect towers, were the ledger books of a monster. Mrs. Gable did not just kill, she curated. He flipped through the pages and found the entries for the last 3 years. The names were cross-referenced with pension amounts, bank account numbers, and estimated expiration dates. Beside Mr. Henderson's name, the date was marked as the 19th of February. Next to the date, a small handwritten note read, "Wonderful hands, such a shame." Mark felt a wave of nausea. He reached for his phone to photograph the pages, but the silence of the basement was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of footsteps on the wooden stairs above. The confrontation was not a scream, but a whisper. Mrs. Gable stood on the bottom step, silhouetted by the light from the kitchen. She was not holding a knife or a gun. She was holding a tray with 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. She looked disappointed, like a mother catching a child stealing cookies. She told him that curiosity was a very expensive trait in a young man. She spoke of the burden she carried, the burden of taking care of those the government had left to rot. She claimed she was providing a service, a quiet exit for the exhausted, while ensuring their wealth did not go to waste in the hands of the state. Her logic was chillingly circular. If no one missed them, did they truly exist at all? When Mark tried to push past her, the door at the top of the stairs opened. It was not a monster that stepped through, but Officer Miller. Mark felt a momentary surge of relief that died instantly when he saw the look on the officer's face. It was not surprise. It was weary resignation. Miller did not arrest Mrs. Gable. He walked down the stairs, took a mug from the tray, and told Mark he was making things very difficult for everyone. The officer explained that the town's budget had been tight for years, and Mrs. Gable's contributions to the police pension fund had kept their patrol cars running and their families fed. The entire structure of the town's safety was built on the bones in the backyard. Instead of killing Mark then and there, they let him go. They knew the power of his reputation versus theirs. Over the next week, the narrative shifted. Mrs. Gable filed a restraining order, claiming Mark had been stalking her and breaking into her home to steal her late husband's mementos. The neighbors, who had been fed her pies and comforted by her smiles for decades, turned on him. His landlord evicted him. The local newspaper, where he had hoped to publish his findings, ran a story about a disturbed young man harassing the town's most beloved philanthropist. Mark found himself isolated, his evidence dismissed as the delusions of a man obsessed with true crime. He moved into a cheap motel on the edge of town, but he could not stop. He returned to the house on the 28th of February, driven by a desperate need to save the next victim. He saw a young woman with a suitcase standing on the porch, being greeted with a warm hug by Mrs. Gable. The cycle was beginning again. Mark realized that as long as the town's belly was full of her blood-stained money, no one would ever see the dirt under her fingernails. He decided to take the law into his own hands, unaware that he was walking into a trap meticulously set by a woman who had been burying her problems for 30 years. On the 3rd of March, Mark broke into the house one final time, carrying a canister of gasoline. He did not want to kill her. He wanted to burn the evidence, to force the truth into the open by incinerating the lies. But the house was silent. He made his way to the kitchen, only to find the young woman he had seen earlier, the one with the suitcase, sitting at the table. She was not a victim. She was holding a ledger exactly like the ones in the basement, and she was wearing Mrs. Gable's pearls. She looked at him with a predatory smile and said, "Grandma told me you'd be back. She says you have a very predictable soul." The floorboards creaked behind him. Mark turned to see Mrs. Gable, but she was not the frail old woman anymore. She was holding a heavy iron skillet, and the strength in her arm was terrifying. The blow caught him on the temple, sending him spiraling into darkness. When he woke, he was in the basement, but not on the floor. He was strapped into a vintage wheelchair, his mouth gagged with a lavender-scented cloth. Mrs. Gable and the young woman were busy at the desk. "The problem with you, Mark," Mrs. Gable whispered, leaning close so he could smell the peppermint on her breath, "is that you think you're the protagonist of a story. But in this house, you're just overhead." She turned to the younger woman. "Write it down, Chloe. March 4th. Heart failure. Such a tragic end for a young man who lost his way." The final horror was not the death that awaited him. It was the sight of Officer Miller walking in with a stack of Mark's own mail, redirected from his motel. Miller handed the papers to the granddaughter, who began practicing Mark's signature on a blank check. They were not just going to kill him, they were going to become him. His bank account, his meager savings, his very identity would pay for the next batch of hydrangeas. As the needle slid into his arm, the last thing Mark saw was the three of them, the grandmother, the granddaughter, and the policeman, sitting down to a lovely Sunday roast, laughing about the weather while the garden outside waited for its new layer of fertilizer. The light in the basement was dim, but it was bright enough for Mark to see the true scale of the operation. He had thought he was tracking a lone predator, a relic of a darker time, but as the young woman, Chloe, flipped through the ledger, he realized this was a dynasty. The dates went back 40 years. Every entry was a masterpiece of cold, calculating efficiency. Written in the 22nd of August, 1985, was a name that made Mark's blood run cold. His own grandfather's brother, the Uncle Leo, who had supposedly vanished into the woods during a hunting trip. Beside the name was a dollar amount, $42.15, and the word complete. Mrs. Gable noticed his eyes widening. She reached out and patted his cheek with a hand that felt as dry as parchment. She told him that the house had always been hungry, and the neighborhood had always been willing to look the other way, as long as the garden stayed green and the taxes were paid. She explained that she was not a monster. She was a gardener of the social order. She took those who were already dead to the world and made them useful one last time. Chloe, she explained, had just finished her degree in forensic accounting. It was a family business now, modernized for a digital age. They did not just take checks anymore. They took identities, credit scores, and digital footprints. As the drug began to cloud Mark's vision, the basement door opened again. It was not just Officer Miller who walked in this time. It was the mail carrier, the one who had been delivering the checks, and the local pharmacist, a man Mark had seen every Sunday at the grocery store. They were not there to rescue him. They were there for the quarterly dividend. Mrs. Gable began handing out envelopes, thick with cash, as casually as if she were passing out party favors. The pharmacist thanked her for the donation to the new community center, and the mail carrier mentioned how much he appreciated the extra help with his daughter's tuition. The town was a living organism, and the boarding house was its heart, pumping the lifeblood of the dead into the veins of the living. Mark tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything to break the terrifying calm of the room, but his muscles felt like lead. He was a ghost before he had even stopped breathing. Chloe sat at the desk and opened a laptop, her fingers dancing across the keys. She was already logging into his social media, posting a pre-written status about how he was leaving town to find himself, how he was sorry for the trouble he'd caused, and how he needed a fresh start in a new city. "You see, Mark," Chloe said, her voice bright and cheerful, "by tomorrow morning, you will not exist. Your landlord will have a digital notice of your departure. Your bank will see a transfer to a new account in a different state. Even your mother will get a text saying you've reached your destination safely. We've become very good at the digital afterlife." The horror was total. It was not just the loss of life. It was the erasure of his soul. He watched as they began to discuss which part of the garden needed the most supplementing. Mrs. Gable suggested the north corner, where the peonies had been struggling since the winter of 2024. She spoke with such genuine concern for her plants that for a second, Mark almost believed she was the saint the town thought she was. Officer Miller stepped forward and checked Mark's pulse. He nodded to Mrs. Gable, a look of professional respect in his eyes. He told her she was doing a great job and that the new patrol car would be ready by the 10th of April, thanks to her generosity. He then turned to Mark and whispered that it was nothing personal, but the town could not afford a scandal, and they certainly could not afford to lose their primary benefactor. The last thing Mark felt was the sensation of being tilted backward in the wheelchair. The sounds of the dinner party continued upstairs, the clinking of silverware, the laughter of neighbors, the sound of a violin record playing softly in the background. The saint of Willow Creek was serving her famous shepherd's pie, and the guests were asking for seconds, unaware or perhaps simply uncaring that the secret ingredient was the very person who had tried to save them. As the darkness finally took him on the 4th of March, the last sound he heard was the rhythmic scrape of a shovel hitting the earth in the backyard. It was a steady, peaceful sound, the sound of a woman who loved her garden and knew exactly how to make it grow. The next morning, the sun rose over number 84 Willow Creek, and the roses had never looked more beautiful. The aftermath was as silent as the graves beneath the petunias. By the morning of the 5th of March, every trace of Mark's existence had been scrubbed from the physical world with the same efficiency one might use to remove a wine stain from a rug. His motel room was found empty, the bed neatly made, with a handwritten note on the nightstand thanking the staff for their hospitality. The handwriting was a perfect match for his own, a detail Chloe had spent hours perfecting while Mark was still conscious. In the digital realm, his profile pictures were updated to show a blurred landscape through a bus window, captioned with a single word: freedom. The town of Willow Creek moved on with a collective, contented sigh. On the 12th of April, the community held its annual spring gala. The centerpiece of the event was the unveiling of a new bronze plaque in the town square, dedicated to Mrs. Gable for her 40 years of selfless service to the disenfranchised. She stood on the podium, looking fragile and radiant in a new silk dress, her granddaughter Chloe standing proudly by her side. The applause lasted for 3 full minutes. Officer Miller, now promoted to captain, stood in the front row, his hand resting on his holster, a smile of genuine affection on his face. The horror of the Gable legacy was its sustainability. It was a perfect, closed-loop ecosystem. On the 20th of May, a new tenant arrived at the house, a retired school teacher named Eleanor, who had no living relatives and a pension that had gone untouched for a decade. Mrs. Gable greeted her with a warm embrace and a slice of lemon drizzle cake. By the 22nd of May, Eleanor's signature had been mastered by Chloe, and her heirloom jewelry was being cataloged for the mason jars in the basement. The most chilling moment occurred on a quiet Tuesday in June. A young, ambitious journalist from the city arrived in Willow Creek, having heard rumors of a miracle grandmother who could stretch a meager budget to save dozens of lives. He knocked on the door of number 84, his notebook ready. Mrs. Gable opened the door, her eyes sparkling with that familiar, maternal warmth. She invited him in, commenting on how much he reminded her of a young man who had stayed with them briefly back in March. She poured the tea, Earl Grey, as always. As the journalist leaned forward to take a sip, he complimented her on the roses visible through the window. They were a shade of crimson so deep it looked like velvet. Mrs. Gable smiled, a small, knowing tuck of the lips. She told him that the secret to a truly vibrant garden was the quality of the soil, and that she had been very lucky lately with her natural supplements. As the sun began to set on the 30th of June, the journalist felt a strange, sudden drowsiness. He laughed it off, blaming the long drive, but Mrs. Gable just watched him with those cold, marble eyes. Behind him, Chloe stepped out of the shadows, already holding a fresh ledger and a pen. The cycle was not just continuing, it was accelerating. The town of Willow Creek was no longer a victim of a serial killer. It had become a partner in a predatory corporation disguised as a charity. The emotional weight of the betrayal was total. Every neighbor who ate her pie, every officer who drove a car paid for by the dead, and every citizen who voted for the plaque in the square was a silent accomplice to the harvest. The final image of the Gable household was one of domestic bliss. 3 generations of women, for a great-granddaughter had just been born, sat on the porch as the moon rose over the Garden of Souls. They were the most respected family in the county, built on a foundation of bone and silence. And as the shovel hit the earth once again in the early hours of the morning, it was not the sound of a crime. It was the sound of a community thriving on the remains of the forgotten.